The sliding glass doors of the bustling shopping mall parted with a soft swish, and Frank, a 79-year-old veteran, shuffled inside, carrying with him the quiet dignity of a life well lived. His red MAGA hat, slightly worn and faded from years of wear, perched proudly atop his silver hair. To anyone else, it was just a hat. But to Frank, it symbolized something far more significant, a lifetime of service to his country, a symbol of the values he still held dear, even as time and politics had shifted around him. The air inside the mall was warm and thick with the hum of conversation, punctuated by the faint melody of a popular pop song playing in the background. Shoppers meandered through the aisles, window shopping, exchanging pleasantries, and going about their business. Frank's gait was slow, but steady. He had been walking these halls for years now, every Thursday without fail, his only routine in a world that seemed to get faster and more complicated by the day. As Frank approached the food court, the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee filled his nostrils, and he took a deep breath, savoring the moment of peace. The mall, with its brightly lit stores and its familiar layout, had become a second home to him after his wife passed away. But today, as he strolled past the busy kiosks, a noticeable shift in energy began to stir around him. The conversations in the food court began to quiet down. The laughter became subdued. It was as though an invisible wall had gone up. People started to notice him, not because of his age or the slight shuffle of his step, but because of the hat he wore, the red MAGA hat. Its presence didn't just catch people's eyes, it seemed to unsettle them. A young woman standing near the entrance looked him up and down, an uneasy expression crossing her face. Two teenage boys whispered to each other, casting quick glances in Frank's direction. The air became thicker, more charged, but Frank kept walking, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to break. The quiet hum of the mall was suddenly pierced by the stern voice of a man from behind him. "Hey, you." Frank turned, startled. A man in his mid-40s, wearing a crisp white shirt and black trousers, stood with two towering security guards flanking him, their eyes locked onto Frank with disdain. This was Keith, the mall manager. "Excuse me, sir." Keith's voice was sharp, cutting through the calm of the food court. "You need to leave." Frank's heart skipped a beat as he tried to process what was happening. He had been coming to this mall for years, and in all that time, no one had ever said a word to him. But today, something was different. "Leave?" Frank asked, a slight tremor in his voice. "I don't understand. What's going on here?" Keith's eyes flickered to Frank's hat, and in that instant, everything made sense. The manager's lips twisted into a scowl, and his voice dropped to a more serious, almost threatening tone. "You can't wear that here." Frank's brow furrowed in confusion. "This hat?" he asked, gesturing to the faded red brim. "I've worn it every time I've come in here. It's just a hat. I'm not bothering anyone." But Keith wasn't interested in explaining. His eyes burned with a quiet anger, his posture stiffening. "We don't tolerate that kind of thing in this mall. It's disrespectful, and it doesn't belong here." Frank wasn't just any elderly man stumbling into a mall. He was a retired Navy veteran who had served his country during some of the most intense and turbulent times in modern history. His hair, now silver and thinning, had once been as dark as the nights he spent in foreign lands, fighting for a cause he believed in with everything he had. He had seen firsthand the devastation of war, the loss of good men in battle, and the weight of leadership during chaotic times. But Frank had endured it all, not only surviving but finding meaning in his service. After returning from the war, Frank spent years building a life, raising 3 children with his late wife, Marie. He worked hard, often holding down multiple jobs to make ends meet, but it was worth it. His children grew up strong and healthy, and his family became his world. He lived for them, for the values he had fought for, the freedoms and opportunities that this country had promised. Frank wasn't wealthy, but he had earned respect through years of hard work and sacrifice. Now, at 79, Frank found comfort in small routines. Every Thursday morning, he would walk into this mall, a place he had grown to love in his later years. The mall was one of the few places in the world where Frank felt at ease. The food court was peaceful, the hustle of the shoppers not too overwhelming. Over time, he'd become a familiar face, and the regulars knew him as the elderly man with the red MAGA hat. But today was different. Frank had entered the mall with his usual calm, prepared to enjoy his weekly outing. The same mall he had visited for the past few years. Nothing seemed amiss, until he made his way to the food court. The usual calm was gone. The air was thick with tension. It was as though the mall had suddenly transformed into a battlefield, and Frank had unknowingly walked into the heart of it. He moved forward, still unaware of the stir his presence was causing. Shoppers now eyed him as he passed, whispering to each other in hushed tones. His heart beat faster, but he continued walking, his steps measured, steady. He wasn't going to let them get to him. The barista at his favorite coffee kiosk gave him a brief, awkward smile, but quickly turned away, too hesitant to say more. Even the familiar sounds of the food court, orders being taken, food being served, seemed muted, as if the world around him had suddenly slowed down. As Frank neared the bench where he always sat, he heard the voices behind him. The manager, the security guards. They were moving toward him now, and he couldn't shake the sense of unease growing in his chest. Without warning, they approached him. Frank hadn't expected it, but somehow, deep inside, he knew it was coming. The whispers, the judgment, it was all too familiar. "Sir, I need you to leave," Keith said again, his voice growing louder now, drawing attention from the people around them. Frank stood still, unsure of how to respond. "I just want to enjoy my coffee," Frank said softly. "I've done nothing wrong." Keith's expression hardened. "You're not welcome here." That hat. His voice trailed off, as if he couldn't even bring himself to finish the sentence. The mall manager was clearly agitated, his hands slightly clenched, his jaw tight. He wasn't just angry. He was determined to get Frank to leave. He wasn't going to back down. But Frank, now realizing the full gravity of the situation, decided that he wasn't going anywhere. "I've been coming here for years," Frank replied, his voice steady but calm. "I've never caused a problem. I'm not going anywhere." Keith's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the two men stared each other down. The guards flanked Frank, moving closer, their presence intimidating. One of them whispered something to Keith, but Frank didn't catch it. All he knew was that he was being singled out. The judgment wasn't about who he was, it was about what he wore. And that alone was enough to make him feel as though he didn't belong. "Leave, or I'll have to throw you out," Keith warned, his voice cold and authoritative. The food court had grown silent. The sounds of the mall, the chatter, the clinking of plates, had all but stopped. It was as if the world had turned its gaze toward Frank and his red MAGA hat. People stood watching, some unsure of how to react, while others simply observed in silence. But Frank wasn't backing down. His heart pounded, and the pressure of the moment was beginning to mount. He had never been in a situation like this before. Never had he felt so alienated in a place he had once considered safe. Just then, the mall manager's voice rose again. "I don't care who you are. You are causing a scene, and we won't tolerate it." Keith's words sliced through the air, the sound sharp and biting. Frank's gaze flickered around the food court. Shoppers had gathered around, phones raised, recording the entire interaction. Frank wasn't sure what they were expecting. Was this entertainment to them? He had never been one to make a scene. He wasn't here to cause trouble. But his presence, his hat, had somehow become the focal point of a crisis no one saw coming. "I haven't done anything wrong," Frank repeated, his voice growing stronger. "I just want my coffee. I want to sit in peace. Why is that so wrong?" Keith took a step forward, his face red with frustration. "You're disrupting the peace," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "You need to leave. Now." Frank looked at the manager, his eyes unwavering. He had fought for this country, for its freedoms, and for a simple right he had taken for granted: the right to be left alone in peace. His heart was heavy, not with fear, but with frustration. He had been a soldier, a father, a husband. And yet, here he was, standing in the middle of a mall, being told that his very existence, symbolized by a red hat, was no longer welcome. Frank took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He wasn't going to let them win. "You want me to leave?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Well, that's not going to happen. I'm not causing trouble. I'm not leaving just because you don't like my hat." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Frank could hear the growing unease among the onlookers. Some people seemed to agree with him, while others, quietly, almost apologetically, shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react. Keith's face twisted with frustration. "I've had enough of this. You're disrupting the mall, and I'm going to have you removed if I have to." He turned to the security guards, who stepped closer, their presence more menacing now. But then, something unexpected happened. From behind Frank, a voice broke the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Frank turned, a little surprised. Standing a few feet away was a tall man in a sharp business suit, his expression unreadable. He had a calm, composed demeanor that immediately commanded attention. This man was the real owner of the mall, and he had a reputation for being hands-on and involved in the day-to-day operations of the mall. Keith, caught off guard, immediately turned to the man. Yes, there's a problem. This man refuses to leave after causing a disturbance with his hat. He's disrupting the peace of the mall." The man in the suit raised an eyebrow and looked at Frank's red MAGA hat. He gave Frank a long, appraising look before his gaze shifted to Keith and the guards. "Disrupting the peace, you say? Is that so?" Keith nodded vigorously, sensing his chance to explain. "Yes, sir. This man is a troublemaker. We can't have people like him causing problems in our mall." The businessman smiled faintly, an amused look crossing his face. "It seems like there's a misunderstanding here," he said, his voice smooth and calculated. "But I think we should clear this up once and for all." Without warning, the businessman turned toward the security guards. "Please step aside," he instructed calmly. The guards hesitated for a moment, exchanging confused glances, but they obeyed. The businessman then turned his attention back to Keith. "I've been reviewing the mall's financial records," he began, his tone growing more serious, "and I've come to a conclusion. I'm buying the mall, effective immediately. I'm the new owner." The words hung in the air, shocking everyone in the vicinity. Frank stood in stunned silence, his confusion evident. The crowd murmured, some of them even gasped. The sudden shift in power was palpable, and no one could quite grasp what was happening. Keith's face went pale. "Wait, what? You can't be serious," he stammered. The businessman nodded, unfazed. "I'm very serious, Keith. I've been negotiating this deal for months now, and as the new owner, I have a few changes I'd like to make. The first one is that Frank, the gentleman with the hat, is more than welcome to stay. In fact, I'd like to personally buy him his coffee. And as for you," he paused, the corners of his lips turning upward in a smile that felt more like a warning. "You're fired." The words were like a slap across the face. Keith's eyes widened, and his mouth hung open in disbelief. The security guards, who had been standing by, looked just as stunned. "Fired," Keith repeated, barely able to comprehend what was happening. But nothing," the businessman interjected, cutting him off. "You've been making customers uncomfortable for far too long. You've lost sight of what's important: respect for the people who keep this mall running. I'm here to fix that." The new owner then turned back to Frank, his demeanor softening. "Sir, I'm truly sorry for the way you've been treated. I hope you'll accept my apology, and I'd be honored if you'd stay for your coffee." Frank, still processing the shock of it all, nodded slowly. A small, appreciative smile crept across his face. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. It wasn't just the apology, it was the recognition. Someone had finally stood up for him. The crowd, which had been frozen in stunned silence, now began to murmur in approval. Some people even clapped, while others exchanged smiles. The shift in power was not only surprising but somehow uplifting. For the first time that day, the atmosphere in the mall lightened. Frank wasn't just some old man with a controversial hat. He was a symbol of something larger, the courage to stand firm, even when the world around you seems to be changing in ways you don't understand. The businessman smiled, turned to the cafe counter, and made his way toward the barista. "One black coffee, please, and make it on me for the gentleman in the red hat." He winked at Frank, his eyes twinkling with a kind of quiet satisfaction. Frank watched him, still processing the whirlwind of events. It was a surreal turn of fate. One moment, he had been told to leave. The next, he was being welcomed with open arms, not just as a customer, but as a respected guest. It was a moment of vindication, but it was also a reminder. Things could change in the blink of an eye. Keith, now visibly flustered and defeated, stumbled backward, muttering under his breath as he left the food court. The guards, too, seemed lost, unsure of what to do with the situation. But Frank didn't care about them anymore. What mattered now was that he had been seen, heard, and respected. For the first time in what felt like a long time, Frank could enjoy his coffee in peace as the mall returned to its usual buzz of activity, with shoppers chatting and the soft sounds of music playing. Frank took a deep breath and settled into a nearby chair. He wasn't just a man with a hat. He was a man with a voice, and that voice had been heard. The new owner of the mall had made sure of it.